Hello, and welcome to this fourth installment, my reflection and summarization of Chapter 4 now of The Sources of Christian Ethics by Servais Pinckaers, the French Dominican. This is a shorter chapter, hence the shorter video, so you're welcome. A quick recap of what has been covered so far, because this chapter is a turning point in the book. The introduction in Chapter 1 gave a basic outline and a definition. That was the concern there. Chapter 2 dealt with errors of the modern era essentially in this area of moral ethics. So systems that are overly obligation-based primarily. But he outlined several points in which the systems differed. Chapter 3, that doozy of a chapter, that last video, had to do with how Christian ethics differs from related studies like the behavioral sciences and what he calls art and technique. So he goes much in depth. See my last video there. Now this chapter serves simply basically as an introduction to the main section of the book, which is what is Christian ethics. The first thing in the chapter is that it is. He says that it is, like whether Christian ethics is actually a real thing, and then what it is. So he's going to just give a real brief introduction to the topic in this chapter entitled Christian Ethics, Its Distinctive Character. So he says the main chunk of the book, the next section, large section, is going to put the question of Christian ethics to St. Paul, to the writings of St. Paul, the epistles, the Sermon on the Mount with St. Augustine, so St. Augustine's interpretation of the Sermon on the Mount, what St. Augustine regarded as the pinnacle of Christian moral teaching, and then, of course, with St. Thomas and his new law of grace and his interpretation and his ideas about Christian ethics. So St. Paul, the Sermon on the Mount with St. Augustine, and Thomas Aquinas. You could say the three principal moral teachers in the Christian tradition, Paul, Augustine, and Aquinas, right? So he outlines the problem here at the beginning of the chapter. He asks whether there is specifically a Christian ethics at all, and if there is, if so, what are its characteristic features? So he has a few points here. Up until recently, he says 30 years ago, this is written in 85, so as of the 1950s, mid-century, and before then, the fact of Christian ethics is, he says, taken for granted. So much so, in fact, that many scholars and laypeople assumed it to be the basic foundation of the faith. That if you boil Christianity down, essentially what's at the bottom of it is a bunch of moral precepts, right? That was how foundational the idea of the Christian moral ethic was. It's been called into question in recent times. But because of that background, because it's so foundational for like everyday Christian life, it's a much touchier subject for scholars to critique, and we've seen that. But, he says, it is necessary that we do, in fact, critique it, that we break it apart, that we analyze it, as long as we do that in a constructive spirit. He says it's necessary to do so in order to see its relation to other systems, right? So he cites Thomas and others as theologians, moral theologians who have broken out Christian ethics in a constructive way, in a positive way, right? He says, if Christian ethics were indistinguishable from purely human ethics, the theologian would have no role and would simply become a philosopher, right? So this is one of the things he's going to deal with in this little chapter here is, does Christian ethics in fact exist? Or is it just the same as like natural moral ethics, like a human moral ethics divorced from any kind of religious language? Okay, he's going to say that it actually is its own thing. It has its own distinctive characteristics. The next section here is how the question of the existence of Christian ethics is framed. He says, since Vatican II, some have wondered whether Christian ethics isn't just the same as other moral systems, like I just said. This is a product, he claims, of the secularization in the modern world. Some support the autonomy of ethics as outside of revelation. So many recent theologians have claimed that moral ethics can be done ignoring revelation, ignoring scripture and the tradition. He asks, is morality outside the human person, originating in God, or is it within the human person, to be determined by reason and conscience, by the individual? So if Christian ethics is real, if there is a Christian ethics, that means that ethics has its source outside of the human person, namely in the divine, right? Which gives it an objective character and a particular Christian character. If it's inside a human person, then it is determined by reason and by conscience. So it makes it an individual endeavor, and then you have modernism, right? That's what comes out of that. So he cites a couple of examples. He goes back to a theologian named Suarez. I don't know who this Suarez is. And other post-Tridentine moral theorists who follow a humanistic trend, he says, who tend to individualize moral things. They rely heavily on natural law, which is good in a certain sense, but they neglect Christian sources like revelation and tradition. This, however, didn't present a major problem, like a major rift in the tradition in the past, because they accepted natural law, which Thomas Aquinas builds on heavily, and they accepted the church teaching as well. The problem is that nowadays people don't accept the natural law, they reject it, and obviously, of course, they're rejecting the church's teachings. So now you have individual, whereas the rift happens long ago, it doesn't really, the traditions don't diverge until recently, when the sort of ramifications of rejecting revelation come into play, right? So that's that first section. That's the frame of the issue. Second, point number 2, is entitled A Contemporary Response to the Question of Christian Ethics. So he uses here a moral theologian who had written a book 5 years before this was published. A book by a Father J. Fuchs, who is a prominent theologian contemporary theologian of Pinckaers. And he has this idea that he delineates 2 levels of Christian ethics. There's 2 basic levels. Number 1, the categorical level. This is behavior, norms, categories of virtues like justice, chastity, fidelity, etc. Those would all be characterized as categorical, like moral items, right? So these are on the ground, practical, day-to-day examples of moral choices, right? Justice, chastity, fidelity, etc. He has that categorical level. That's number 1. Number 2 is called the transcendental level. This includes attitudes and norms that sort of interpenetrate the categories of the categorical level, that take a general view of the human person, and human persons who experience faith, love, life seen as sacramental, the imitation of Christ, etc. So this transcendental level of the human person is, there are some advantages. In the next section, he's going to list the advantages and the disadvantages of Fuchs' distinction. The transcendental level, he sort of praises that the introduction of that into the dialogue, because it views the human person as a holistic, as a whole thing. It doesn't, it gets away from that obligation system, and it looks at the whole scope of human freedom and analyzes that in terms of morality. So he praises that. So he goes a little bit into what Fuchs makes of these 2 categories. He says, clearly the transcendental level is undoubtedly a Christian, right? So Fuchs is asking the question of whether there is a Christian ethics, and he says, yes, at the transcendental level, certainly there is a Christian ethics, because the imitation of Christ, life seen as sacramental, those things are deeply Christian. To look at the moral life in those terms is to look at it as a Christian. So undoubtedly, there is a Christian ethic, according to this theologian, J. Fuchs. Father J. Fuchs. He goes on to say, however, Fuchs, the author, that Scripture is less clear on categorical level issues. And he asks the question, are there specifically Christian ways of behaving at this level, at the categorical level, at the day-to-day level? Fuchs says that on the categorical level, there is really no difference between natural and Christian ethics. It is at the broader level of of transcendence, at the transcendent level only, that a particular Christian ethics is made clear. At this level would be things like intention. So you can perform categorical level moral acts with the intention at a transcendent level, which is explicitly Christian. So like I can perform acts of charity, I can give money to charity, for example, because in order to imitate Christ, in order to, I can perform penances in reparation for my sins, at the transcendent level, but the actual moral actions, the things that you do, those are really, they can't be separated out from a non-Christian humanistic moral system. This is where Pinckaers has he lists some advantages and some disadvantages. So let's get into that. Pinckaers' response. He says he likes Fuchs' system, where he considers faith, charity, imitation of Christ, etc., that transcendent level. He says where he breaks into free human acts not limited to obligation, right? So absolutely, that's what Pinckaers was really stressing at the beginning of the book. So he likes that in Fuchs' system. But he cites some problems. He says, by differentiating these two levels, transcendental, categorical, Fuchs is able to maintain orthodoxy with the transcendental level by saying that there really is a Christian ethics, like maintaining the tradition. But at the same time, he's able to concede to humanism in some respects on the categorical level, where almost all practical moral discussions and decisions occur, right? So while he's able to sort of claim orthodoxy, like I'm in line with the mainline tradition of the Catholic Church by saying that there is a Christian ethics at the transcendental level, at the categorical level, which by the way is where most discussion, abortion, euthanasia, contraception, etc., all the hot button moral issues, those take place at the categorical level. At that level, well, there's no real difference between a Christian ethic and a humanistic ethic. Pinckaers goes on to say, despite his efforts, Fuchs fails to show how the transcendental level penetrates and informs the categorical level, leaving the latter, the categorical level, open to unorthodox developments. Okay, so by separating these two, and apparently in his book, Fuchs tries to avoid that as much as possible, but Pinckaers is not convinced, and he says by separating these two, the categorical level is left open to unorthodox developments, essentially. Secondly, also by separating these, Fuchs doesn't give just consideration to the fact that what is done in day-to-day moral actions on the categorical level directly affects also the transcendental, which he says is how the church recognizes mortal sin, for example. So when someone commits a discrete sin, like on the categorical level, it also does injury to his disposition of charity and his transcendental moral character. So what we do on the categorical level is directly related to that transcendental level, that whole sort of moral disposition, the broad sweep of our moral life. Those things aren't really separable from each other. So Pinckaers asks how Christian virtues and human virtues can be brought into relationship. So he sees Fuchs' system. He recognizes some good things, but he recognizes some dangers in that system that Fuchs has set up. He's worried about the separation of those levels, such that you can claim to have a genuinely Christian ethics, while on the practical level, the really sort of on the ground important level, make all kinds of concessions to personal conscience and stuff, which is what you see politicians and people doing all over the place nowadays, right? So Pinckaers asks, how can Christian virtues and human virtues, he says, how can they be brought into relationship in an organic and helpful way? His answer is Thomas Aquinas. Big surprise from the Thomist. He says that Aquinas' system is not very different from Fuchs' solution, but it better integrates the moral or human, those are equated, virtues, underneath the theological ones into an organic system. He says, to do this, we must enter the moral theory of virtues. This is fantastic. We're going to get into virtue ethics now, which is the best. He says this is very different from the theory of norms and obligations. There it is again, right from the beginning. He says, the last sentence, this is the crux of the problem. So, anticipating the later chapters, which are going to be according to the structure he laid out at the beginning. St. Paul, St. Augustine on the Sermon on the Mount, and Aquinas. The crux of the problem is viewing a moral system, viewing moral life in terms of obligation and norms, as opposed to viewing moral life in terms of virtues, right? Which is the classical way that the mainline tradition of the Catholic Church has approached moral life. He's, I think we know where he's gonna land. He's gonna side squarely with Aquinas and the tradition of the Church in promoting virtue ethics, which is very exciting. So thank you again for joining me. This has been chapter 4 of the Sources of Christian Ethics. Super excited to get on to Paul, Augustine, and Aquinas. Thanks.